So I think it's that part of the afternoon where everybody's like starting to fall asleep a little bit. So, we're gonna just try to do something to wake everyone up. So if you've ever heard of Bitcoin, stand up. Oh man, this goes so much better than it used to. All right, now keep standing if you've ever opened a Bitcoin wallet. So we'll lose some. Now sit down if you've never done a Bitcoin transaction. Well, this is actually weird. Okay, sit down if you've done under 25 Bitcoin transactions. And now just everyone sit down. But like a big round of applause for these three people up here. I don't think I've ever had an audience where more than 2 people had done at least 25 Bitcoin transactions, which I think kind of illustrates in a way how far we have to go. And this stage is a little weird, just so everyone knows. It's like an intense amount of light, so I can't really look at you. And there's no podium, so I can't really look at that. So you're just going to have to bear with me. If you've got a question at any point, just throw your hand up, and I'm more than happy to take it. So Bitcoin is a lot of things, but the things I like to think about it is that it's a global payments technology, a mathematical protocol, an open and public secure ledger, a peer-to-peer network, the world's largest distributed computing project, and most importantly, open for use by anyone. So it's a permissionless system. If we all suddenly felt really inspired by my talk, we could all whip out our laptops and immediately start working on the core protocol itself or using the core protocol for anything that we thought was interesting. Bitcoin is not controlled by any institution. Neither is the blockchain. So despite the company name, we're not in control of the blockchain. And then it's not proprietary. It's completely open source. Actually, as a company, we open source almost all of our software. And it's not bound to any location or jurisdiction. So it's not geographically limited in any way. Well, how do you utilize Bitcoin, right? Because ultimately, things are only really interesting if they're useful. Well, there's a couple use cases for Bitcoin currently. One is as a store of value. The other is to transact, basically like person to person. And then the last is to pay for goods and services. Blockchain, the company that I'm the CEO of, is the larger provider of open source Bitcoin software. We build basically innovative software that makes Bitcoin safe, easy, and secure. And we do that for consumers and businesses anywhere in the world. So whether you are someone living in San Francisco, Soma, and you're like obsessed with all the latest tech trends, you know who you are, or you're a cafe owner in Buenos Aires, we target basically anybody who wants to use the core Bitcoin protocol, which brings with it its own set of challenges. This is our growth over the last couple years, which kind of tracks closely in the industry. We're up over about 3.4 million individual consumer accounts now. This is really a great slide to talk about sort of the opportunity with Bitcoin. If you look at our market reach, you look at almost the entire world. We haven't quite made it into Central Africa yet, but we're working on that. And so you think about well, why is Bitcoin exciting? Why are people investing in it? Why are people working really hard on it? It's because it represents a huge opportunity for these sort of vast market segments that are on the right side of the slide. This is transaction volume. Oh man, this is the slide deck that we sent them 2 weeks ago, not the one we sent them last weekend. This is going to be fun. Transaction growth. So let's talk about the advantages of the Bitcoin protocol. Most of them have to do with basically the idea of it being permissionless, so that anybody can kind of plug into it. The challenges are also related to that. So one of the key points about the Bitcoin network is that anyone can use it. So good actors can use it, bad actors can use it. And then past that, their transactions are irreversible. So if a bad actor somehow breaches your system, transfers all of the Bitcoins to their own account, there's no way to reverse that transaction basically ever. And so what you end up with is a internet security situation or a web application security situation with much, much higher stakes. So you kind of think about that in the light of common web user practices. 10% choose passwords that are complex and long enough to resist attacks. So 1 in 10 password is actually useful for protecting users. 50% of people use passwords that are basically related to like very easy to guess things. And then 14% use some like combination of their personal name, which is basically like, you know, the equivalent of just kind of leaving the door unlocked and open. The most like common places are like Dallas, Canada, Boston, or like people do numeric strings that are sequential. And you can go out on the dark market today and buy like a list of the 100,000 most common passwords for like $25. You know, of course, payable in Bitcoin. And then you can run an account against that list of passwords. And so where Bitcoin gets really complicated is you have this intersection of really high stakes, internet web application security, and on top of that, really poor practice. So there's two models for solving this. One is to basically implement like a Bitcoin bank. This is what I call like a custody or vault solution. And then the second model is more of a software solution, which is what we do. Wow, we might, yep, let's go back. Let's talk about the sort of custody or vault solution. So this is the idea that you can't trust an average user to have an actual Bitcoin wallet. So instead what you do is you sort of have a Bitcoin bank where a user can deposit their Bitcoins with you, and you hold them and you ostensibly protect them. The problem is that you're basically creating a risk pool. So as you grow and your metrics go up and things go very well for you, the sort of target profile that you present grows ever larger. So like maybe the first week that you're open, you only have 100 users and they've deposited 100 Bitcoins. 2 years down the road, maybe you have 100,000 users and there's 100,000 Bitcoins on deposit that are worth $100 million. Suddenly you're an incredibly attractive hacking target because people can steal that, they can put it on a flash drive, and it's completely fungible. So it's completely able to be divided, split, sold, laundered into useful proceeds. If you compare that to like a normal bank heist, like if someone was going to go in and steal cash, like $100 million of cash is like a semi-truck. You need like a serious vehicle to transport that. It's not just a flash drive. And then if you think about it in the context of like a normal digital financial hack, so like your Citigroup and you get hacked and someone transfers 10 million out, use the correspondent banking system to pull that back in. So what you end up with is like a very attractive hacking target. Well, there's ways that you can mitigate against this risk. One of the biggest one is at an operational level. So people basically say, okay, I've got this huge operational risk. Let me split up who has access to the storage, who can control the storage, and how like online that storage is, which is where you come up with this notion of cold storage. So that's very operationally intensive. You need to basically have redundant vault infrastructure. You need to have physical security. You need to have application security on top of that network. And then you need to be incredibly careful when you link that sort of very secure storage to your less secure storage, because that's the moment that you can leak. There are a lot of companies that experimented with this model in this space. A lot of them have had real problems. And so to date in the Bitcoin industry, something like 700 million in consumer funds have been lost. The majority of that occurred when a exchange, Mt. Gox, which I'm sure a lot of you have heard of, that was in Japan, was breached and their cold wallet was breached. And so their ability to manage risk was eventually outpaced by their growth. Now there's a second risk mitigation strategy that a lot of people pursue in tandem, which is insuring the deposits. So this is the idea that you obtain a really intense cybersecurity insurance policy so that if someone breaches your vault system, the insurance company pays out. And this is a great solution for consumers. Unfortunately, it doesn't really scale all that well because eventually you end up in a situation where your like really cool programmable digital money that has a radically different cost structure suddenly has a very high cost structure because you have to insure it against a very real threat. So second model is a software model. And this is basically the idea that we've pursued, which is that like we think that everyone deserves to have their own real Bitcoin wallet. And what I say by that is not just an account at a Bitcoin bank, but an actual Bitcoin wallet with a private key that can move your Bitcoins around the public Bitcoin blockchain ledger. So how does that work? Well, basically a user downloads our wallet software onto their client side, so onto their phone or into their browser, and an encrypted backup from our server. The wallet and the keys are then decrypted locally in their browser. And then the user does whatever they need to do with Bitcoin. So they want to check their balance, they want to send, they want to receive. When they're finished, that's re-encrypted on the client-side device, and then a tokenized backup is transmitted back to the server. So what does this mean? This means that from an architecture standpoint, instead of having a lot of funds accumulated in a few wallets, you have some funds accumulated in, as it is today, 3.4 million wallets. And so the risk is much more spread, which means that because no one can know the balance of a wallet in advance, that as a sort of cybersecurity issue, even if you were to breach our server, you would have to spend quite a lot of computational power to basically brute force decrypt every single tokenized backup. And of course, we've got quite a lot of security around making sure that doesn't happen. Basically, it's a way to spread the risk. So then it's like, well, what's the downside of this system? Because obviously not everyone went after this, so there's got to be some trade-offs. The biggest trade-off is it's very dependent on web security practices. So if you're a very conscious user of the internet, it basically worked brilliantly. If you are one of those people, and I'm sure none of you are in the room today, that has ever used a password that's like the name of the street you grew up on followed by 1122, things could get difficult. So we knew this, so we started implementing solutions around basically device authentication and two-factor. And this was able to dramatically decrease the number of phishing attempts on our user base. So I guess it's like a fundamental issue of philosophy. Like, do you try to solve these problems from a sort of operational model or a risk aggregation model, or do you try to solve them from a software approach, which is what we've always pursued? Oh, wow. So this is what happens when you submit your slide on the Sunday before the conference. If any of you are ever going to be speakers, they're really serious about that whole deadline thing. So we're missing a lot of slides. Let's do questions. We've got 5 minutes, and my deck just suddenly went right off the screen. Does anybody have questions? Sweet. Yeah, so it's also going to be really hard to hear in here, but what I think your question was how are we going to increase adoption of Bitcoin? So that's something that's been talked about a lot recently. I don't think there is a fundamental adoption problem. I think that the adoption problem that a lot of people see is stalled growth in North America. So like for us, most of our, and they're typing on the screen now, most of our growth is coming from emerging markets like Latin America, from places like Lithuania, and places like Indonesia, which is a huge growth market for us. And so in those markets, growth is actually accelerating month over month. In North America, where most people's use case was like as a store of value or as a speculative asset, growth has basically dropped off. But to give you some perspective, like in the last couple months, we've added 1 million users, and we've gone from 6 months ago doing 30,000 transactions a day to doing 60,000 transactions a day now. So I don't think growth is fundamentally stalled. I think that growth for some companies in the markets that we're going after is stalled. And I think there's a big difference there. Now in terms of like how do we make Bitcoin more useful to average people, I think the answer is that like we definitively have to make it easier to use. And the way to make it easier to use is to basically make it the security aspect more dynamic. So when we look at products today, we've done about as much as we can do around device authentication, around velocity control, around second factor. What we're looking at now is like, how do we not just do things that automate security for the user, but how do we start to proactively educate the user about security practices? And I think that's going to be incredibly important to us as a company, as sort of like the stakes get ever higher for people's online internet security, but their knowledge of best practices isn't going up in tandem. And so like one of the things that I joke about all the time is that there really should be a class in high school that's like how to use the internet, right? It's like a fundamental thing that we do all day long. We all use the internet, we all use computers, but we don't really receive any training on it, right? We just kind of like, we all do whatever we thought we were told was a good idea. But the reality is that most of us are really horrible about our online security. And so a key challenge for us within that context is being much more dynamic and teaching people how to be more secure from within our own platform. That was a long answer to a short question. Does anybody else have a question? Yes. So I think the question, and you can just give me a thumbs up, I think the question was, what year does Bitcoin become a part of our lives? Sweet. I actually don't think Bitcoin will probably really ever become a fundamental part of most of your lives. Unless you live in certain parts of the world where financial infrastructure is really poor, I just don't think it offers like a huge amount of like fundamental value to you in most cases. I think that if people in this room, and I think like everyone here has at least one credit or debit card, I think people in this room are much more likely to use Bitcoin in the background. So there's a lot of interesting use cases around infrastructure for the financial products that we all use. But I think in terms of like natively using Bitcoin as a fundamental part of your life, I just don't think it's going to be something that most of us end up using because we already have pretty good access to financial services. Actually, they're not going to let me take another question. They're flashing a message. But I think the thought I want to end on is like, one of the really interesting things, because this is an enterprise stage, is that we're kind of living in a world where our online, our online life and our offline life are really merging really quickly. And we're living in a context where web security is more difficult than ever, but the stakes to securing data, whether it's around our Bitcoins or our internet banking or our personal data, is becoming more and more important as more and more of it's going online. I think one of the really interesting things about the Bitcoin space is that it really forces a lot of these issues because it's internet security with such high stakes. And so I think that you're going to see, like, generally speaking, as far as internet and web security practices go, a ton of innovation come out of the Bitcoin space in terms of security engineering that'll be really applicable to a lot of people that build enterprise software. And I'll leave it at that. Thanks.